Hello, welcome to the 2021 Richard T. Greener Lecture. When we unveiled the statue of the first African-American professor at the University of South Carolina, Richard T. Greener in 2018, we wanted there to be an annual lecture or event in his name. His teaching career here at USC was cut short by the end of Reconstruction, but through this lecture, we wanted to give it a way to live on. So, who was Richard T. Greener? Here's a photo of the unveiling. This is what the plaque at the base of this statue says. Professor of Philosophy, scholar, librarian, and law graduate of the Reconstruction era University of South Carolina. Born in Philadelphia and raised in Boston, Greener attended preparatory school at Oberlin College and Phillips Academy, Andover. He was the first African-American to graduate from Harvard College and the first African-American faculty member at the University of South Carolina from 1873 to 1877. He later served as the Dean of Howard University Law School, as Secretary of the Grant Memorial Monument Association, and as a U.S. consular officer to Vladivostok, Russia. Of course, there's much more, but that gives you an idea of who he was and why we wanted to honor him at the university. As you can see, there are no limits to the number of topics we could cover that relate to Greener's life, career, and legacy. Greener graduated from Harvard a year after the first intercollegiate football game was played between Princeton and Rutgers in 1869. So I assume that he was at least familiar with the sport, but I have no idea what he thought of it. But I do know what he thought about civil rights. On that point, he was clear. So clear that he often put his own life on the line and at risk to stand up as an activist for equal rights. Our speaker today is Eddie Comeaux, who is going to speak about the intersection of college football and civil rights. This talk is part of the exhibit that Amber Fallucca and I have curated for the Museum of Education, which is a companion to our new book on the history of college football. Eddie Comeaux is a professor of higher education and executive director of the Center for Athletes' Rights and Equity at the University of California-Riverside. He focuses on the college student experience with special attention on athletes and underserved students, and how those experiences influence their subsequent work outcomes after college. Access and equity are core to his work. The title of his talk is Choosing Their Battlefields: Paul Robeson and Other Black College Football Players' Activism in Racial Equity. As you were entering the room, you heard Paul Robeson singing Joe Hill, one of his favorite protest songs to perform. I recently discovered that Greener and Robeson are distantly related, making today's topic all the more appropriate. For the students in attendance, please remember that there is a special session for you that will immediately follow this lecture to have a conversation with Professor Comeaux. One final word of thanks before we begin to Toby Jenkins at the Museum of Education and to Spencer Platt and Simone Gaz at the Center for Innovation and Inclusion in Higher Education. Amber and I are grateful for their support and sponsorship of this event. Now, I am very happy to turn it over to Professor Eddie Comeaux.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson, for that warm introduction. I am excited to be here. This is an opportunity for me to share some of my work on the interplay of athletics and higher education with a specific focus around athlete activism. So thank you to Amber Fallucca, excuse me, sorry if I mispronounced that name, Tony Jenkins, Spencer Platt, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Richard Southall, who's the director of the Sport Research Institute. He's been doing some amazing work around college athletics and continues to really pave the way for those coming behind him. as I thought about today's presentation, trying to compile all the information and resources about Richard T. Greener, and certainly appreciate Dr. Anderson's sources and materials that he was able to share with me. And I had a greater appreciation over time of the work that you all were doing on the ground. And, unfortunately, I have to, to present to you all virtually, because Charleston has a place for me. I'm not sure if you all are aware. I played baseball in the Texas Rangers organization, and I also played for the Charleston River Dogs way back in the day. I believe they have a new stadium, a relatively new stadium, but I played in the older stadium right across the street from the Citadel. So going back, it certainly brought back memories as I begin to prepare for this presentation. And we are thinking about Richard T. Greener as I talk about athlete activism today. So again, it's great to be here. And in preparation for today's talk, I devoted some time to reading, rereading, and trying to get a better sense of Richard T. Greener and his life, his accomplishments, his legacy. And among other things, it was quite evident, as Dr. Anderson laid out in his opening remarks, that Greener was a champion, an activist for justice, right? For change. And in kind of preparing for this, I thought about, as Dr. Anderson showed the 9-foot statue of Greener next to the Thomas Cooper Library, what that statue might represent, what it might embody today, particularly in this moment where critical race theory has become a political buzzword and rallying cry for conservative-leaning folks across the country. Today, states are working to ban this school of thought, whether it's teaching about racial history, systemic racism, white privilege, intersectionality in K-12 public classrooms. And CRT opponents argue with well-organized efforts that teaching CRT creates division, it indoctrinates white students to hate themselves and hate their country. And this is not a new narrative. The irony here is that this 9-foot statue of Greener at USC, and even other statues across the country of those who fought for racial justice, really force campus members who stop and observe the statue, whether it's students, whether it's faculty, admin, visitors, alums, and so on, to really reckon in part with how anti-Blackness is foundational to American society, how racism manifests itself in various social institutions, and I would say equally important how Richard T. Greener has some level of success in spite of rigid anti-Black policies and laws. And so as much as this 9-foot statue of Greener might push one to really wrestle with our painful history, it is also uplifting, empowering, instructive, and liberating, and what I call campus making. And campus making refers to the ways that people endeavor to create places where they collectively derive a sense of everyday pleasure, right? Expression, joy, humanness within campus environments. And the statue of Greener becomes a site of new possibilities, where you really turn a campus space into a meaningful place of social interaction. And the statue can represent a place where people share histories, experiences, ongoing struggle, and various forms of resistance. So based on Richard T. Greener's history, I would say a history as a trailblazer, as an advocate for change. I don't think Richard T. Greener would want it any other way. So as I think about his strong resiliency, his intellectual prowess that he possessed, and you'll see as I kind of talk about the story of Paul Robeson, how that equally plays out in terms of his level of success in spite of a very racist, violent history that he encountered, as well as some of the present day athletes. And so for this talk as I think about, athlete activism, and specifically Paul Robeson and some of our more recent college football players. I am standing on the shoulders of giants. And what do I mean by that? I've been able to have a heightened racial consciousness, social consciousness, as a consequence of this formal educational journey that I went, am on a ride and really trying to do some work that makes a difference. And so I'm thinking back to when I was a recruited athlete out of high school around 17 years old. And I was fortunate to be able to play both basketball and baseball and have scholarship offers. But I still remember to this day, my dad coming into my room and asking me, as I narrowed it down to baseball, he said, son, and this was specific to Cal Berkeley, he said, there's a 6'8" sociologist at Berkeley that said that any Black parent that sends their kid to Berkeley on an athletic scholarship should be tried for child abuse. And then at 16 years old, I began to process that and really think about what that actually means. And he was referring to this structural arrangement of college athletics, right? Where there are many athletes that are viewed as commodities and expendable, right? Where there are largely white athletic stakeholders who are benefiting quite handsomely on the backs of a disproportionate number of Black athletes in revenue generating sports. And so that had to sit with me for a while. And of course, at 16 years old, I really didn't listen much to my dad. And I went on to Cal Berkeley as both a student and athlete. And it was probably one of the best decisions that I was able to make, because I was able to connect with that 6'8" sociologist by the name of Dr. Harry Edwards, who I consider a mentor to today. But whether it was in the classroom, he was such a gifted orator that all his words seemed to resonate with me and just kind of pour into my soul. Whether it was off campus, on campus, during office hours. I would like to think that part of why I'm here today in the academy is a result of Dr. Harry Edwards. And I say that with this slide here in the top right. There's a picture of John Carlos and Tommie Smith, the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games, with John Carlos and Tommie Smith's head bowed, fist clenched, protesting human rights, right? Harry Edwards was the mouthpiece behind that boycott. It never really materialized, but to this day, it certainly raised some awareness about the injustices and the work that athletes are doing to raise awareness, engage in a deeper understanding, and bring about some change, right? So I really like to name the fact of Harry Edwards and the work that he's doing. I'll come back to that in a second. And someone else who I think, as I think about Paul Robeson, a good friend and good colleague of mine, Dr. C. Keith Harrison, who has the Paul Robeson Research Center at the University of Central Florida, who's done a lot of work around using Paul Robeson as a model to think about what might be a true scholar and athlete. And so with all of that, today's presentation, I'm going to work within a framework that Dr. Harry Edwards talks about. It's a century of Black athlete activism. And this first wave that he refers to in Black athlete activism had to do with this struggle for legitimacy to address racial injustice. And so in that first wave, you had athletes like Jack Johnson, Major Taylor, Paul Robeson, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, who were really struggling for legitimacy. This second wave dealt more with access to a system that was largely white, right? And during that time, they were cautioned about engaging in any conversations or mobilization around race or discrimination. They were cautioned to remain silent. And so you have folk like Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Kenny Washington, who were part of that second wave of athlete activism. The third wave, they were more vocal. They were more politically active. They were more racially conscious because they were trying to disrupt structures. They were trying to agitate a system because a system that they were excluded from. And so you had the likes of Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, Kurt Flood, and of course, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, among others, that were really searching for race consciousness, raising awareness, and really disrupting the current flow, the current structure. And then lastly, Dr. Harry Edwards talks about this fourth wave, and that's more contemporary athletes that are engaging in the struggle, who are about pursuit of power, right? If you recall, in 2014, Kane Coulter, the then quarterback for Northwestern University, was really trying to push up against the system so that athletes can bargain collectively, right? So they were in pursuit of power. They were certainly trying to disrupt systems. And so for this presentation and kind of an overview, I'm going to focus on the first wave and the fourth wave. The first wave really spotlighting Paul Robeson, the role of racism in his college pathway, of course, his struggle for legitimacy, as well as the different forms of activism, the ways in which he really engaged communities, engaged the system in ways that he was really trying to be a champion for change. And then, of course, with the college football players activism from 2015 to the present day, I'm going to spotlight two movements. It was the Missouri football team, along with several non-athlete activists on their campus. More recently in 2020, during this global pandemic, I will talk about the We Are United movement and their pursuit of power. And then lastly, as I think about the sum of this activism, what does this really mean in the bigger scheme of things? So I'll talk about power. I'll talk about sort of reformist in nature, as well as transformation for this presentation. And hopefully we'll be able to leave some time for some Q&A at the end of this. But let me start with Paul Robeson, who is often referred to as Roby. And if you haven't got a copy of Martin Duberman's 800-page plus volume biography of Paul Robeson, I encourage you to think about that, because it really chronicles the life of this global icon, of this global activism, what he was able to accomplish in his life. So I'll start off with a quote by Roby. "I admired my father, but I loved my mother." Paul's father was a runaway slave at 15 who migrated to the North and eventually graduated from Lincoln University with a degree in theology. And his father became a pastor and eventually lost his job. He was forced out of his job. And he went through some fierce trials along the way. But as Paul, as he saw his father's journey, he saw what he had to endure. Paul appreciated that. You know, Paul had tremendous respect for his father and his father's perseverance. You know, his father would always say to him, "Stand for what you believe in, son. Stand by your values. Stand by your principles." And that's something that really stuck with Paul throughout his career, particularly in times of controversy, in times where he encountered violent racist attacks against him. His father prepared him for that. His father was one who set him up and prepared for him for those survival imperatives. So he really admired his father for what he endured along the way, what he accomplished, and how he had just the strong resiliency and perseverance. And he loved his mother. Paul's mother died at age 5. In fact, her dress caught on fire, and she died the next day. Dr. Anderson mentioned this earlier. Paul's mother, on his mother's side, they were actually distant relatives of Richard T. Greener, which is something that I wasn't aware of until I was exposed to An Illuminated Life, which was a biography on Richard T. Greener's daughter, which is a whole nother lecture. And I encourage you to look at that, because it really talks about kind of the intersections of race, economics, of upward mobility. And I think it was a fascinating read to hear her life story. Roby was the third Black student at Rutgers and the first Black football player at Rutgers, which I'll talk about here in a second. He earned 15 varsity letters in football, basketball, baseball, and track. In fact, Paul was so dominant that the state officials changed the rules so that opposing teams actually had a chance to stop him, right? That's how elite of an athlete that Paul Robeson was during his time at Rutgers University. He was valedictorian at Rutgers for the graduating class of 1919. And again, very noteworthy. He spoke more than 20 languages fluently. I mean, he was a brilliant scholar of language and world culture. And he delivered Rutgers' commencement address, which I'll return to the commencement address here shortly. So when you think about Paul Robeson as an athlete, as an elite athlete, you know, he survived the violence and racist attacks of white Rutgers football teams who attempted to kill him. Paul, you know, early on as an aspiring college football player, he was invited to an open tryout, which they call non-varsity scrubs. So, you know, if with non-varsity scrubs, you likely had a long shot of actually making the team. And so Paul was the only Black football player on the team at the time. And on the first play of scrimmage, Paul got the ball and his entire team piled up on him and broke his nose. Eventually, he had a sprained shoulder. They spiked his hand during those workouts. And, you know, ultimately, he had a broken spirit. So imagine someone going onto the gridiron at age 17, and you would think that your teammates there are there to protect you, but they're opposed to you. They're violently trying to chase you away from something that you've dreamed about, right? So imagine that. And Paul contemplated quitting. But as he reflected on those principles, those values that his father instilled in him, he understood, as his father told him, that he had a special responsibility to his race, right? He had a special responsibility to his race. And, you know, his father suffered more than anyone else in the family. So for him to quit because he was attacked by his teammates versus what his father had to endure, he knew that he couldn't quit. He knew that he had to continue on because he was a representative of his race. And here's a quote by Roby. When I was out on a football field or in a classroom or anywhere else, I was not there just on my own. I was a representative of a lot of Negro boys who wanted to play football and who wanted to go to college. And as their representative, I had to show I could take whatever was handed out. So his father, again, strategies of survival. His father would constantly remind him of his obligation to his race. And that played a role in terms of his perseverance, even in a time of racist attacks and the violence that he encountered. And so Roby eventually made the varsity team. Why? Because he was an elite athlete and they understood, right, that they're much better with him than without him. So the sort of overt racism was replaced by the admiration for him. But as the title of this slide, you know, I want to be clear, right? Because if Roby was just an average player, right, there's a chance that he would not be on the team. And this sort of falls with Derek Bell's interest convergence theories, that the rights, the opportunities of Black people only advance when the convergence with the interests of white people, right? And so again, he was an elite athlete. They saw something in him that he can contribute to their bottom line, which is winning games. And of course, he was on the team. But again, just to reiterate, if he was a mediocre player, there's a likely chance that Paul would have not been on that team. And perhaps not even being a student at Rutgers University, because part of this I would argue appeal of Paul Robeson is the fact that he was a true scholar and athlete, but what was really driving the admissions process? Was it his athleticism or the fact that he was such a great and gifted intellect? And so as much as Paul competed with passion on the field, he was also competed with passion in the classroom and the broader academic community. What do I mean by that? You know, Paul Robeson understood the paradox of Black America. He understood the tensions and contradictions that existed within larger society. And, you know, Duberman said this in the biography, that at an early age, Paul Robeson was very race conscious, right? Where he would actually bring groups together in conversation to talk about racial inequalities. And his primary motivation by bringing folks together, some who he didn't even know, is to raise their awareness around racial inequities. It was to have a deeper understanding of what it means to be Black in America. And then ultimately his goal, his aim was to really action, to create some kind of change, to get people to really think about what they can do to disrupt structures. So Paul was, you know, quoted as saying, do something, right? And that is, if you have that knowledge base, if you have that understanding, right, how can you play a role in disrupting the current racial inequities? And so that was something that Paul Robeson was, really adamant about raising awareness and engaging in a deeper understanding of these issues. And again, going back to those contradictions, he always thought about, like, why do we have inadequate, educational opportunities for Black people? Another contradiction: why are Black people being denied first class citizenship, yet they are fighting and dying in wars, right? Like, this was something that he certainly spent a lot of time talking about. So as much as we think about Paul Robeson, the athlete, he was also one who was really trying to be a resistor, resisting the current structures, which he thought was the best way to create a more level playing field. How was he resisting? What were his forms of activism? He was a writer, right? He was a gifted orator, and he engaged in a lot of advocacy work to raise awareness around a lot of these issues. And I would say one of the defining moments of Paul Robeson at Rutgers University is his commencement speech. It was in June of 1919, at the height of Red Summer. It was an eight-month stretch in which violent race riots broke out in cities across America. 83 Black men were lynched, and Paul Robeson delivered the commencement address. And here's an excerpt from the New Idealism, from his commencement speech. And it is safe to say that from that commencement speech, that Paul left no doubt about the kind of freedom, about the kind of inclusiveness, about the kind of conditions that he wanted and sought for Black America. Ultimately, Paul Robeson was his father's son. His father endured a lot. He understood what he was up against, and he understood a path forward that would be more inclusive for all people, not just a select few. And my last bullet point here, it wasn't until the last 25 years, 1995, that Paul Robeson was finally inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. Last 25 years, he was a scholar, he was an athlete, he was an actor, he was a singer, and he was a global activist. And, again, going back to the work, the center with Dr. Keith Harrison, who tries to exemplify who Paul Robeson was through his teaching. And for us to remember the important work of Paul Robeson, and hopefully others who are current athletes aspire to the greatness of Paul Robeson, That's something that I envision. That's something that of all the athletes that I encounter, I certainly expose them to Paul Robeson because of his life, because of his legacy, because of what he was able to accomplish. Let me pivot from Paul Robeson to talk about this fourth wave. And if you have any understanding of the interplay of athletics and higher education, we understand that the structural arrangement of college athletics is not a fair exchange for the disproportionate number of Black athletes in revenue generating sports. And because of that lack of fairness for athletes in those sports, and because of those contradictions, we're starting to see more and more pressures of trying to disrupt the system. We're starting to see more advocates of athletes attempting to push for change. This has been going on for decades, right? We saw some inroads with the recent approval of member institutions that allows athletes to monetize from their name, image, and likeness, which happened on July 1 of this year. But we also know that there are other issues that we need to tackle, whether it's guaranteed medical benefits for athletes, whether it's ensuring that they get the revenue that's generated in a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? To ensure that athletes are actually graduating and getting meaningful educations, right? Education. So these are the kinds of things that we're constantly wrestling with as scholars, as researchers, as advocates for athletes, who I would argue are some of the most vulnerable institutional actors on the campus in terms of the exploitative structural arrangement of college athletics. And so as I think about this fourth wave of athlete activism, we know the great work of Colin Kaepernick. We know the great work of many current and former athletes, college athletes, specifically in football, that have engaged in this work, right? And these are calculated risks. If we understand the structural arrangement of college athletes, they are not protected. They are not a protected class, particularly with the policies that we have in force. Athletes have 1-year renewable scholarships. Their scholarships can be non-renewed for any reason, whether you're in good academic standing or not. So the fact that athletes are put in that position, I don't expect athletes to organize, to mobilize. I don't think they're protected. It shouldn't be their responsibility. It shouldn't be that pressure on them. But we do see athletes doing that, right? Because many of these athletes are first generation, low income athletes, maybe their first time in college. They should not have to be subjected to that, right? We should see all these stakeholders involved in athletics that are advocating for fairness. Those are the ones that should be pushing for change. Those who benefit the most or reap the benefits from college athletics should be the ones that should be pushing for change if they believe in fairness, right? If they believe that the level playing field should be a level playing field for others, particularly because they are the ones who produce the product. So with that context, I'm going to focus on two movements. The first movement had to do with the University of Missouri in 2015. There were non-athlete activists, particularly Jonathan Butler, the hunger striker, among others on the campus, that were protesting against a hostile campus racial climate. They felt that there were activities going on the campus that led to isolation, an unwelcoming environment, a toxic environment for this group. And so Mizzou football players joined Black campus activists and refused to play until the school's president resigned, right? So that was the pressure, the leverage they had. And just to be clear, this did not become a news frenzy. This did not become a spectacle until the Missouri football player joined in with hunger striker Jonathan Butler and said, you know what, we're not gonna play until, one, the president resigns, and two, you address our demands. You address our demands. And so with that leverage that Mizzou football players had, of not playing until they got some of their demands met. Actually, not their demands met, but the school president resigned, and then eventually they put out a list of demands. They would lose $1 million, right? And they would have to forfeit their game. So think about, again, the structural arrangement of college athletics, right? In a multi-billion-dollar business where a lot of this is taking place on the backs of disproportionately Black athletes who are recruited, right? Who oftentimes are not being fairly compensated. And so Mizzou football players posed a threat to those in power and to the status quo. The football president, the university president eventually resigned, which to me wasn't a newsflash because of that push and the fact that they were possibly going to lose $1 million. This goes back to what I concluded with Paul Robeson and the football team actually allowing this elite football player to play. It was about interest convergence, right? The fact that the university might lose $1 million was enough to force the president to resign, right? But ultimately, what actually happened? Was there any structural changes to the ways in which they operate at the University of Missouri? I know that there were a list of demands around representation, more Black faculty, more staff, right? Ensuring that there are diversity trainings that were playing out. And this became actually a domino effect where schools across the country were organizing, mobilizing, and putting forth demands to ensure a more hospitable environment for Black people. Another movement that played out more recently had to do with Black college athletes primarily who are organizing and made a list of demands. And these were a unified group of Pac-12 football athletes who threatened to opt out of the fall season due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so if you're familiar with college football in the midst of the global pandemic, that was something that many researchers and advocates for athletes were paying close attention to, because we knew the severity of this global pandemic and how athletes were not part of a protected class. But you had varying interests and agendas among all the stakeholders in college athletics. My question is, how long are we going to delay and suspend or postpone college football when they know that billions of dollars are at stake, right? And so, of course, sooner than later, NCAA and member institutions found a plan, and they decided to allow football to continue for that fall season. And it was not without much pushback from a lot of those football players and advocates of athletes. And so there were a growing number of demands that these athletes had in order for them to resume play. They talked about health and safety protections, including options not to play during the pandemic without losing their scholarships. They also talked about guaranteed medical benefits. They also wanted a task force to address racial injustices in college sports. And they also wanted a 50% split of the total conference revenue. And ultimately, after it was all said and done, it did result in health and safety protections amid the global pandemic for most, if not all, of those football programs. Getting 50% split, that was a non-starter for member institutions. Guaranteed medical benefits, that was a non-starter. And so the health and safety protections were there. Players did get the option of opting out without losing their scholarship. Again, for most colleges and universities, they made that public. And so there was some leverage there. But ultimately, as I kind of get to this final point that I want to make is, was this truly change? And so the football players' protests were never movements that could bring about structural change and racial justice because of their limited rights and protections in athletics. Unlike, the NBA or the NFL college athletes don't have a union or organization to collectively bargain their rights. And so as I think about the sum of athlete activism across all these waves, from the first wave to the fourth wave, and athletes that are really taking these calculated risks to create a better today and tomorrow, to create a system that is more inclusive for them, is this really about reform and making the system more hospitable to them, where they may have more coaches who look like them, they may have more resources afforded to them that, you know, provide support and better positions them for, you know, life after sport? Or are we seeing the kind of activism today that is transformative, right, in nature, where we truly see a disruption of structure? We're able to reimagine college sports in ways that we didn't see, you know, three or four decades ago. And I've always been one that says that, you know, when you look at the history of colleges and universities, they've never been facilitators or engines of social transformation. So when we think about advocating and athletes being active, what's the end game? What is it that exactly are we trying to accomplish? And those are the contradictions. Those are the tensions that I continue and others continue to wrestle with, is that as we engage in this process of trying to disrupt structures, trying to create more inclusive environments, what is that end game and what might that look like? What does liberation look like for Black people, for Black athletes, for a system that historically has excluded this group? And so as I thought about this Richard T. Greener lecture, I was always locating this within an explicit activist framework and really thinking about all the institutional actors that made up this journey, that made up this fierce fight to really affect change. And I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate this opportunity to engage with you and be in conversation with you, and certainly look forward to continued conversations about this interplay of athletics and academics in higher education with an explicit framework around social justice and activism. So thank you all.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Comeaux. When we started thinking about how can we combine the football exhibit with the Richard T. Greener lecture, we thought, well, who could we identify that could marry these two? And it couldn't have been more perfect. I've got way more than 15 minutes worth of questions, but we'll try and bring it down to a few essential questions to round out the last 15 minutes. First of all, I love your phrase about campus making and sites of possibilities, of new possibilities. That's great. I meant to mention in my introduction that Toby Jenkins, who's the director of the Museum of Education, was director of the Paul Robeson Center at Penn State. So, you know, one more connection there. And speaking of Penn State, in 1918, the Rutgers football team played 7 games, won 5 of them. One of the teams they beat was Penn State that year. One of the teams they lost to was the Great Lakes Navy, because Army bases hosted teams that in 1918 during the World War I / pandemic, great influenza pandemic year. And that was one of their only 2 losses. And that team went on to win the Rose Bowl. So that was a pretty remarkable team that they lost to. But that brings me to the fact that Robeson played during that great influenza pandemic season, which has parallels to our current, you know, situation of playing football during a pandemic. Do you know if he spoke at all about the pandemic or surviving it or anything about that?
You know, I had a chance to look at the Museum of Education exhibit, And I saw the conditions during that time, and obviously the connections to what's playing out present day. I did not hear Roby talk at all about those conditions and how that impacted them. I would assume, just like the conditions are today and how athletes are perceived, that they're disposable commodities, that if we can find a source of entertainment, if we can find a way to make some of the most vulnerable actors a source of entertainment, then let's figure out how to do that. The gridiron is tough, right? Like it's a very violent sport. And I just think that the perceptions of athletes during that time, and even today, you see this playing out where, for example, SMU, their coaches and their staff said that, you're going to have to sign a waiver saying that you're not protected if you get COVID, or if you have some negative consequences as participating in this sport. We also saw other schools that came out with having players sign liability. So I would like to think, as much as we'd like to think we're more progressive and we have advanced when it comes to college football and protecting players, you would think that during those times there was probably minimal or no protections for athletes, and they were more so viewed as a source of entertainment.
Yeah, the season was shortened, and some historians, I think, erroneously blame it on World War I, but it's really more the pandemic.
Right.
And a couple of weeks ago, Amber and I were giving a tour of the museum exhibit and to a University 101 class, and the student said, "What was the effect of the Great Depression on college football?" And I said, "Not much. It still kept going on." I emphasized exactly what you just said. Look, the pandemic of 1918 did not stop football. World War I did not stop football. The Great Depression did not stop football. World War II did not stop football. Vietnam, on and the list goes on right up to present day. COVID
Right.
in 2020, COVID in 2021, football persists. And Amber likes to say it's too big to fail.
Absolutely. You could just look at the scandal at Penn State. Too big to fail.
Right. Exactly. One other connection I want to mention, and here again is one that we could spend all day just on this one, is you mentioned Harry Edwards, and we have a whole chapter in our book, and I'll just show the audience real quick. I know that you've seen it. This one chapter by Mark Van Overbeek, Football, Athletic Protest and Reform at Cal State Campuses in the 1960s. And who's at the center of this? Harry Edwards.
San Jose State.
At San Jose State. And in my chapter, I talk about the Wyoming 14 at Wyoming in 1969. They wanted to wear an armband to protest racism when they were playing against BYU, and they were all kicked off the team. Like you say, commodities, the coach and the governor weren't, they were all in cahoots on this, kicking them off, and they weren't smart enough to at least adopt the interest convergence and say, well, this isn't in our best interest. The next day, Wyoming beats BYU without them, but then they lose every other game the rest of the season, and every game except one the next season, and have terrible seasons going forward. But what's interesting is that next week, San Jose State comes to Wyoming, and what do? Every single player from San Jose State wears a black armband. White and black players wear a black armband in support of the Wyoming 14. And of course, who's behind that? Your mentor, Harry Edwards. So, it's amazing to see all of these convergences, all of these things coming together. The last thing I wanted to talk about to kind of bring us back, I started by introducing Greener. you made some comments about him. But as I'm listening to Paul Robeson's life story, and I knew a little bit about him, but now I know so much more, the parallels to Greener are quite remarkable. I mean, both of them are brilliant scholars, multilingual, great orators. Both of them, we don't have any recordings of Greener, of course, but both are great orators. Both talk about this special burden that they had to share or shoulder. And it brings us to this question of what could have happened if either of them had been given kind of full rights and access to the life that they were capable of. I know what if questions are hard to answer, but maybe you have a sense of what might have been with Paul Robeson. I mean, it's unbelievable what he did accomplish. So what more could have been?
That's a good question. And, there's also, I'll just say this before I answer your question. We know that Richard T. Greener was appointed as a U.S. commercial agent in the Soviet Union, right? And so we also saw that Paul Robeson studied Russian and arranged for his son, Paul Robeson Jr., to study in Moscow. So that's also a connection between Richard T. Greener and Paul Robeson during that time. And of course, as his son was studying in Moscow, Robeson actually visited the Soviet Union to perform on occasion, as he's a gifted, entertainer. So that was one connection that I saw in my readings and rereadings where there was certainly some kind of connection, along with the fact that they were distant cousins, as you've pointed out before. When I think about, the kind of legacy of Richard T. Greener, Dr. Anderson, I think about Paul Robeson, I think about, James Baldwin. They all left a legacy, and whether it's through their teaching, whether it's through their writing, whether it's through their oratory skills, they left something, a legacy that really informs how I think, how others think. And so I don't know, I spend less time thinking about like what could have happened if they were fully allowed and not restricted and really able to maximize their intellectual prowess. I'm not sure. I'm sure that we probably would have seen a broader, more impactful legacy that certainly might have been. But I'm excited. I've always been excited about the work they've done, and I've appreciated their work, and I've accepted what they brought to the table. And I think when I see heroes, when I see champions for racial justice, I oftentimes say, what is it that they can do to really push me, expose me to something that I haven't thought about? Because I really think that exposure leads to expansion of the mind. Expansion of the mind can lead to new possibilities, right? And so as much as we might think about what could have happened, I really think they left a legacy, something central for us to hold on to and really inform how we move forward in a very equitable way.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And that leads us to, we'll use this as our concluding question of what is the path forward? How do we move forward? What is the role of athletes, athletic administrators, academic administrators, other allies? Because you talked about how athletes advocate, but they have limitations on what they can actually accomplish. So what is the path forward to get that structural fundamental change that you said is ultimately needed?
So I think Martin King said, why should we integrate into a burning building, right? I think there's multiple approaches we can take. I see what typically plays out in college sports is that we tinker with the edges. We talk about reform in nature, and that is essentially kind of masking the larger structural issues that exist. So as much as we have approval on NIL and allow athletes to benefit from their name, image, and likeness, in my view, that's not structural change. That's making the system more hospitable to groups that deserve it, right? So I think we need to do, it shouldn't be an either or, it should be a both and. So I think we should continue to work to create a system that's more hospitable, something practical. Why do we see a disproportionate number of Black athletes in football, yet we have a small percentage of Black head coaches, right? It sends the message that this is not a welcoming environment, that it's racially hostile, right? That you're not welcome on the scene, right? And so you've heard calls from journalists and others say, well, why don't Black athletes start attending HBCUs and areas where they might feel a little bit more supported, right? So that's one thing that we need to continue to do is try to increase representation. But I think the larger question you're asking, how do we advance equity and justice, right? What does that look like in practice? And I'm afraid that even going back to Harry Edwards and what he's been saying in the late 1970s and 80s, I hear him say all the time, I've been saying the same thing in the 70s that I'm saying today. Before I didn't really have a platform. Now they accept what I say and they like what I say. And so part of me is really thinking about how do we reimagine or imagine a different system. And part of that might require abolition, right? Where we're really engaged in activities that do away with the governing system of the NCAA, right? Which also includes member institutions, but can we envision a different system? Because we have it in intramural sports, and intramural sports doesn't have the same kinds of concerns that this multi-billion-dollar industry has, right? So sport inevitably recapitulates society. So we have some of the same issues in society with vulnerable actors, and the question is, how do we ensure that they have the resources so that they can have the kinds of lives, quality of life that other people have? So I don't have the answer, but what I do know is that we need to imagine a different system. And as long as we continue to work within the system to produce Band-Aids and cover up Band-Aids and try to find small incremental victories, 50 years from now, we'll be asking the same question. So I'd like to say, let's burn it down. Let's start over. That's when we'll really see true change, and all the stakeholders will feel like they're adequately a part of a system that we think could be a source of entertainment, that could be fulfilling for large numbers of folks who are invested in college sports.
Well, that is a perfect place to end. Hopeful but revolutionary. Thank you, Professor Eddie Comeaux. Thank you to the Museum of Education. Thank you to the Center for Innovation and Inclusion in Higher Education at the University of South Carolina. Thank you to my co-curator and co-editor, Amber Fallucca. And one more time, thank you, Eddie Comeaux, for being here. We appreciate it and look forward to future conversations. Thank you, everyone.